Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in about 30 seconds. Okay, it looks like we have a lot of people joining us from all over. The numbers have stopped going up, so I'm going to get started. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to this public launch of a call for banks to adopt an Amazon exclusion policy, a commitment to end financing and investment for oil and gas activities in the Amazon biome. I'm Sapora Berman, the International Program Director at Stand.Earth, and also the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in Vancouver, Canada. We're grateful today to be joined by Indigenous leadership from CONFIE, the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of the Ecuadorian Amazon, Andreas Tapia, Nimo Andi Gagita, Nanki Wampakit, who we will be hearing from shortly, as well as from Angeline Robertson, Senior Researcher from Stand.Earth Research Group, and Pendle Marshall Hallmark, Climate and Finance Campaigner at Amazon Watch. Although they couldn't be here today, Marlon Vargas, President of CONFIE, and Jose Gregorio Diaz Mirabel, General Coordinator of the Coordinator of Indigenous Organizations of the Amazon Basin, known as COICA, have also made some comments that we'll share shortly with you. This is a campaign launched in collaboration between Amazon Watch and Stand.Earth, with support from partner Indigenous federations in the Amazon, including CONFIE and COICA. Before I begin, I want to remind everyone that there is an interpretation feature available for your use. You can click the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and select the language you'd like interpretation in. Today's program will be available in Spanish and in English. There is also a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible from the audience at the end of our call today. And our team is on hand to also answer in real time for any that we cannot get to verbally. So please join us and submit your questions using the Q&A feature. With that, I'm going to turn over to Pendle. Can you explain a bit more of the context here? Why are we seeing this push now, and what exactly is in the policy?
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today. The Amazon exclusion policy is, as you said, Zipporah, a commitment from banks to stop financing or investing with their asset management arms in companies carrying out oil or gas exploitation related activities in the Amazon biome. So this call is really coming at a critical time in the history of the climate movement. We're seeing an unprecedented level of public pressure on financial institutions to shift out of fossil fuel financing in efforts to meet the Paris Climate Agreement goal of limiting global warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius this century. There was an IEA report released in May that identifies further expansion of oil and gas projects beyond those already committed as of this year, as inconsistent with a pathway to net zero by 2050. There was an IPCC report released in August that pointed to the importance of cutting emissions early on and rapidly this decade. And Indigenous federations representing over 500 nationalities and more than 4 million people actually just successfully put forth and passed a measure at the IUCN Congress to protect 80% of the Amazon by 2025. So the push for an Amazon exclusion policy and exit strategy really follows a precedent we want to explain to folks that was set by the successful Indigenous-led push on major banks to exclude financing for oil and gas drilling in the Arctic, which many banks committed to in 2020. And these Arctic exclusions, many adopted by banks, we've identified as currently highly exposed to oil and gas financing in the Amazon, were not only geographic in nature, but also made with strong rationales around the need to mitigate climate change, preserve biodiversity, and of course, respect Indigenous rights. So we're using that same framing and reasoning as a roadmap to make the case for an Amazon exclusion. And we're already seeing the devastating impacts of global warming everywhere, obviously, but it's important to really point out the significance of its impacts in the Amazon rainforest. There are huge human rights implications to climate change in the Amazon. It's home to thousands of indigenous peoples who've been stewarding and maintaining the rainforest's ecology for millennia. And these people are being attacked and killed at increasingly high rates for defending their territories from extractive projects. And this is something that we've seen when you look at lists of the most dangerous countries and places in the world for environmental and land rights and indigenous activists. Some of the most dangerous places to be a land and indigenous rights activists are in the Amazon, places like Colombia and Brazil. And we're also seeing biodiversity significantly impacted, right, when the Amazon is hurt. The Amazon holds approximately 10% of the world's biodiversity. It's essential to ecological functioning and to global food supply chains. And of course, it's a key part of climate change mitigation, right? It regulates regional water and weather systems, and absorbs about 120 million metric tons of carbon each year. But of course, and as I'm sure many of the folks tuning in today are aware, the Amazon is already reaching a tipping point due to the rapid deforestation and unprecedented fires that have been set largely by people incentivized to clear land for industrial activities. Parts of the Amazon have reached what scientists now call a tipping point, which is the point at which the forest goes from being a significant carbon sink to a carbon emitter, giving off more carbon than it actually absorbs. And this will, of course, have catastrophic effects on the global climate. So oil and gas, and I think this is an important point to make as we're leading off this discussion, are often not considered deforestation industries in the financial sector and by most people, right? In the same way that agro-industrial activities are. But it bears mentioning that oil and gas industries are often the first to cut into pristine parts of the rainforest, fragmenting the forest and paving the way for other industries to develop it further and raise that forest even more. So in short, because of the Amazon's significance as a home to indigenous peoples and as an ecological powerhouse in the fight to avoid the worst effects of climate change, it really is incumbent upon banks to urgently adopt a policy and exit strategy that will rapidly phase out financing and investment for oil and gas from the biome. And we're going to hear more about this in a moment from our colleague Angeline Robertson about the details of the Amazon exclusion policy and exit strategy that we're calling on banks to adopt. But I want to outline three of its key components and elements for everybody. The first is an immediate commitment by the end of this year, at the latest, to not finance or invest in the expansion of any oil or gas activities in the Amazon biome. So in expansion. Two is a commitment to end by 2025 financing and investment for any and all companies that are currently engaged in oil or gas activities with the purpose of facilitating the responsible wind down of operations. So first is expansion. The second is existing operations. And the third point that we have in this exit strategy is a commitment to exit all loans, letters of credit, and revolving credit facilities for all traders actively trading oil or gas originating in the Amazon biome by the end of 2022. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that in a moment from Angeline Robertson. But in our research to build out this campaign, we identified a number of major banks that are heavily exposed to oil and gas in the Amazon and have reached out to them to discuss the possibility of adopting this exclusion.
Thank you so much, Pendle, for that really important context. We'd like to hear from Indigenous leadership now and are joined by members of the Leadership Council of CONFIE, the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of the Ecuadorian Amazon. I hope, I don't see it on the screen, but I hope we're joined by Nimo Andy Gigita, Women in Health Director, Andreas Tapia, Communications Director, and Nanki Wampaki, Director of Territories. I'd like to start by first sharing a few quotes from leaders who could not join us today, but who play a critical role in this work. The first is a quote from Jose Gregorio Diaz Mirabal, General Coordinator of COICA, the Coordinator of Indigenous Organizations of the Amazon Basin. He writes, "Our collective fight to defend our territories is a fight to protect the planet from the climate crisis we are currently living. A geographic exclusion policy is a commitment from banks to exclude all types of financing and investment in any kind of oil or gas activity carried out in the Amazon. This is an urgent and necessary proposal that aligns with our call to protect at least 80% of the Amazon rainforest before 2025. The IUCN has already approved this measure, and corporations must follow this mandate. Any bank that continues to support the fossil fuel industries that are destroying the largest tropical rainforests in the world cannot declare itself an ally in the fight to protect our future and that of the planet." Marlon Vargas, president of Confinae, has stated that the banks that finance this destruction are complicit in what is a genocidal threat for us and an existential threat for all of humanity and our planet. Very powerful quotes from those leaders, and we're so delighted to have several leaders from the Amazon joining us today. I want to ask Mr. Tapia if you could explain a bit about how Confinae has resisted oil and gas activities on its territories previously, and why Confinae considers the push on banks to demand an Amazon exclusion policy important.
Muy buenos días con todas las personas que nos están escuchando y siguiendo a través de esta plataforma. Agradecer mucho a la invitación y a este evento organizado conjuntamente, donde también estamos participando como dirigentes del Consejo de Gobierno de la Confeñae, y las palabras que se leían de los testimonios de nuestro presidente Marlon Vargas reflejan muy bien lo que es nuestra visión al respecto. Y sin duda la Amazonía ecuatoriana tiene un proceso histórico de lucha y resistencia. Desde su fundación en el año de 1980 ha sido constantemente la amenaza por la ampliación de la frontera extractiva, la constante dentro de nuestras organizaciones. Pero frente a ello, la lucha y la organización de las nacionalidades, las organizaciones de base, ha hecho retroceder a muchas de las empresas, sobre todo petroleras. Recordemos en la década de los 80s y los 90s la empresa Burlington, que pretendió implantarse hasta la década del 2000 en territorios del centro sur amazónico. También la amenaza de varias compañías en torno al bloque 28, sobre todo las empresas como Tripetrol, entre otras, que también en la década del 2000 no pudieron implantar sus proyectos extractivos debido a la fuerte resistencia en la provincia de Pastaza de las nacionalidades y los sectores sociales. El caso Sarayaku, donde la compañía petrolera CGC tuvo que retroceder y salir frente a la gran organización del pueblo quichua de Sarayaku, que en ese momento enfrentó a la compañía petrolera, y que luego incluso la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos estableció medidas cautelares en favor de ellos ante la vulneración de derechos colectivos. Y más recientemente también el caso de la resistencia guaraní, donde se obtuvo una demanda histórica de acción de protección que blinda 220,000 hectáreas de territorio amazónico, evitando que este sea explotado en territorio guaraní. Todos estos procesos de resistencia se han dado pese a que los intentos del gobierno de ampliar la frontera extractiva han sido constantes. En la década del 2007 al 2017 se dio el intento de ampliación de la frontera petrolera con la ronda suroriente durante el gobierno de Rafael Correa, pero esto también tuvo la respuesta organizada de las nacionalidades y no logró concretarse. Incluso en el gobierno anterior de Lenín Moreno 2 bloques tuvieron que ser declarados, un bloque tuvo que ser declarado en fuerza mayor al no poder realizar procesos de extracción. Actualmente tenemos varias amenazas en el bloque 28 en la provincia de Pastaza, donde están asentadas las cabeceras principales de los ríos Napo y Pastaza, que alimentan las cuencas del Marañón y el río Amazonas, pero existe un proceso de resistencia. Frente a ello, un tema de fondo y central para nosotros es lograr que los bancos realmente adopten una política ambiental que no vulnere los derechos colectivos y que realmente esté en el marco de los derechos a la naturaleza que tiene la Constitución del Ecuador, una de las más avanzadas en términos de defensa de los derechos, pero que al mismo tiempo no se cumplen cuando las empresas intentan pasar por encima de los derechos colectivos de los pueblos y nacionalidades y de los propios derechos de la naturaleza. Por ello, el hecho de que varios bancos hayan asumido el compromiso de dejar de financiar el comercio de crudo, precisamente procedente de los bosques ubicados en el centro sur amazónico, para nosotros es un gran avance, es un logro importantísimo porque refleja una campaña de incidencia y sobre todo un resultado concreto que conmina a que más bancos vayan adoptando este tipo de políticas. No solo bancos estadounidenses o bancos europeos, también los bancos asiáticos o también de cualquier parte del mundo, porque caso contrario, el compromiso que los estados, que los gobiernos han asumido, y actualmente lo ha dicho el presidente de la República, de ampliar la frontera petrolera, de duplicar la producción petrolera en el país, lo que hace es comprometer nuestros territorios, comprometer más de 3 millones de hectáreas de los bosques mejor conservados del planeta. Estamos hablando de las zonas en torno al Parque Nacional Yasuní y otras zonas que son consideradas de la mayor biodiversidad en todo el mundo. Si estas zonas fueran, o ya están concesionadas, pero si estas zonas fueran abiertas a los procesos de exploración, de prospección y mucho peor de explotación, realmente se comprometería toda nuestra forma de vida, todo el equilibrio entre el ser humano y la naturaleza que se mantiene en nuestras comunidades, pero además el equilibrio planetario para todo el mundo en una época en la que combatir el cambio climático es un compromiso y es una decisión de los gobiernos, más bien son los pueblos originarios, somos las organizaciones desde las comunidades los que verdaderamente estamos cumpliendo con nuestros compromisos de proteger el medio ambiente. En ese sentido es para nosotros importantísimo que los bancos adopten estas políticas ambientales, tomen el ejemplo de 7 bancos que ya han decidido dejar de financiar el comercio de crudo y empiecen a establecer políticas ambientales amigables con el medio ambiente, favorables a los pueblos, sobre todo que no vulneren nuestros derechos y que permitan avanzar hacia una etapa verdadera de transición ecológica más allá de la extracción de combustibles fósiles hacia sociedades post-extractivas armoniosas con el ambiente, como ha sido la forma de vida de los pueblos, de las nacionalidades y de nuestras comunidades desde tiempos consuetudinarios y que actualmente continúan siendo así. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Andreas. We do have, I see, Ms. Nimo Gigita has joined us. I see your camera is off, but I saw you there a minute ago. Can you hear us? Ah, there you are. We're wondering if you could share a little bit about the experience of the people living in the areas affected by oil and gas exploitation in the Amazon. Can you tell us a bit about where you live and how the oil and gas companies have impacted the health of people living there?
Buenos días a todos, mi nombre es Nemo, soy de la nacionalidad guaraní. Actualmente estoy como dirigente de Mujer y Salud en la compañía. Para nosotros, el pueblo guaraní ha sido el más afectado dentro de los territorios amazónicos con la contaminación del petróleo, porque la mayor parte de nuestro territorio en la provincia de Orellana ha sido contaminado. Nuestros hermanos joromenanis también viven en una selva cerrada actualmente porque hace un año nos mandaron a encerrar en nuestras casas por el tema del COVID-19. Mientras tanto, el gobierno autorizó para que ingrese 7.5 kilómetros en el Parque Nacional Yasuní. Entonces, con eso se lleva más contaminación, más deforestación a nuestros territorios amazónicos, y es preocupante porque el gobierno, en vez de apoyarnos, en vez de protegernos, lo único que está haciendo es destruir nuestra selva, contaminar el medio ambiente. Nuestra fuente de vida es el agua, estamos contaminados. Entonces todo eso nos repercute, toda la familia amazónica que vivimos en la selva, con las enfermedades que nos estamos padeciendo, y es muy difícil para nosotros esta situación. En la selva amazónica hacemos un llamado internacional que nos tienen que visibilizar, hablar para que estas cosas ya no sigan sucediendo en la selva amazónica, porque nosotros también estamos cuidando la selva, pero el gobierno nos está destruyendo, nos está aplastando. Entonces las luchas que tenemos aquí, las nacionalidades contra las empresas petroleras, madereras, mineras, es muy fuerte. En la Amazonía estamos siendo invadidos por el tema del activismo a gran escala. Es un monstruo que está llegando muy fuertemente en la selva amazónica, y nosotros como indígenas y como mujeres estamos al frente luchando, llevando nuestras voces de lucha contra todo el activismo que está ingresando a la selva amazónica. Entonces para nosotros es difícil. Nosotras como mujeres estamos en la primera línea luchando, combatiendo contra esto que está sucediendo en nuestra selva amazónica, y también nosotras estamos visibilizando nuestros trabajos de mujeres a través de nuestras artesanías, a través de los proyectos productivos, haciendo las luchas también para que vean lo que está sucediendo en la Amazonía. Es duro vivir en la Amazonía, tener que pasar todos los días luchando contra los extractivistas que están llegando cada día a nuestra selva amazónica. Gracias.
Thank you so much. It is scandalous what is happening in your territories, and your strength and persistence is an inspiration to us. I'd like to turn now to ask Mr. Wampakit to tell us about the indigenous solutions to this crisis. What kind of actions would you like to see the banks take, and what kind of justice would you like to see for your communities?
Muy buenos días, amigos, amigas de distintos lugares que nos están por este medio escuchando. Saludos de parte de Nanki Wampanqui, dirigente de territorio de la Compañía, que abarca las 11 nacionalidades y 23 organizaciones. Realmente sería muy importante de que los bancos, quienes están financiando al extractivismo, tomar la conciencia y dejar a un lado que la planeta nos necesita, nos pide ayuda, de que no matemos a los seres vivos en la Amazonía. Con eso quiero decir de que nosotros estamos luchando día a día, los pueblos y nacionalidades, luchamos por conservar, por tener este ambiente, esta Amazonía linda. Pero sin embargo, el gobierno y el desarrollo, entre comillas, la palabra desarrollo, es lo que nos está acabando. Con eso quiero decir también de que el gobierno en estos días hizo un decreto para la extracción de recursos naturales en la Amazonía. El decreto 95, que más claro da toda la accesibilidad a las empresas transnacionales como petroleras y mineras puedan ingresar absolutamente con toda esa garantía. Y en eso nosotros hemos estado luchando y estamos al frente luchando para poder decir de que no estamos de acuerdo con la extracción petrolera y minera. Entonces, esto quiere decir de que nosotros estamos al frente y queremos nosotros, para poder hacer todo este proceso, luchar, conservar el bosque, queremos de que los bancos, quienes están financiando para la extracción de recursos naturales en la Amazonía y en el mundo, puedan invertir más bien en desarrollo, lo que es economía. Economía indígena que sería que financien los emprendimientos de las nacionalidades, poder hacer una economía conjunta aquí, sacando todo lo que tenemos nosotros. Emprendimientos puntuales que las familias necesitan. Es verdad de que en el norte, centro y sur vemos cómo están destruyendo. En el sur, la minería. La minería, el río Zamora hoy se encuentra bien contaminado. No hay peces y la familia les toca comprar ahora sí enlatados. En ese sentido, necesitamos de que si fuera nosotros tuviéramos recursos para poder invertir, sería muy importante que cada uno de las nacionalidades tengan su vida sana, sin contaminación, y para eso pido de que los bancos puedan financiar directamente a las nacionalidades o pueden invertir recursos directamente a las nacionalidades, porque somos nosotros quienes estamos conservando, estamos cuidando el bosque. Y en ese sentido, dentro de eso, a veces se ve, más claro, se vulnera el tema del derecho a la naturaleza. En la Constitución está, en uno de los artículos, está derecho a la naturaleza, derecho a la conservación, pero sin embargo, el gobierno con ese decreto que dio el 95, mata todo lo que está en la Constitución, lo que está escrito. Y en ese sentido, hoy es momento de poder reflexionar, que las nacionalidades se pronuncien, y estamos pronunciándonos en este momento a nombre de las 11 nacionalidades, a nombre de las 23 organizaciones que corresponde a la Confeñey. Nosotros estamos en pie de lucha. Y en ese sentido, yo quisiera invitar a los hermanos, amigos, que hoy necesitamos de ustedes, de todos. Nos queremos, nos buscamos para poder fortalecer y tener nuestro espacio territorial sin contaminación. A más de lo que ya está, pero queremos conservarlo, y en ese sentido invito a cada uno. Nosotros lo que queremos es cómo poder luchar o cómo poder fortalecer a la Amazonía, es dejando de explotar todo lo que es recursos naturales, que si acabamos con todo eso, no tendremos vida para nuestra generación. De mi parte, muchas gracias a todos y gracias por la invitación.
Thank you so much for those powerful words. I think it's very clear from your example that the recent green lighting from the Ecuadorian government on further oil drilling highlights the failure of government leadership right now at this important moment in our history, and the urgency of this exclusion, the need for the private sector to act. I want to remind everyone to please submit questions for our speakers. You have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, and I'll turn now to Angeline Robertson, the lead researcher at Stand.Earth, to talk about the original research done to build up to this policy and what we know about the bank's exposure to Amazon destruction this far. Angeline?
Thanks, Sephora, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Sechelt people on the west coast of Canada. We first began doing research on this issue in 2020, examining crude oil trade flows from Ecuador, exports to global exports, but also imports into the United States. And we found that many European banks were acting in violation of their own environmental commitments. We actually found that since 2009, top European banks had financed the flow of about 150 million barrels of oil, worth about $10 billion US, from the Ecuadorian Amazon to US refineries. This was a violation because a lot of these banks make commitments to preserving intact rainforests, biodiversity, to not financing or investing in activities that lead to deforestation. But actually the oil and gas industry in the Amazon is responsible for all of those things and more: corruption and pollution, and infringement of Indigenous peoples' rights. So last year, the top 6 banks named in our report made commitments, some of them public and some of them not, to stop financing the trade in Amazon oil from the headwaters region of Ecuador and Peru, which is an important first step towards an Amazon exclusion policy, since the majority of the current crude oil production that is exported from the region comes from Ecuador. However, efforts at oil and gas expansion across the Amazon, e.g. in Colombia and in Brazil, threaten the efficacy of these trade finance commitments. So we needed to take a wider scope, both geographically and in terms of the bank's products and services, in order to capture not only current production areas, but areas of planned expansion. So we pivoted from that earlier research to a wider scope, examining not only oil trading, but all elements of the oil and gas industry and activities in the Amazon biome. As a result, the Amazon exclusion policy covers a geographically expanded area that is the entire Amazon biome, including Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, parts of Bolivia, parts of Venezuela, areas of Suriname, and et cetera. And there's a great definition of that available from RISE, and we can provide a link to that after the webinar. But that geographic exclusion was really important to capture not only current production, but also areas of planned expansion for oil and gas. We also expanded to look at exploration, development, production, trade, and transport, for example, by pipelines, and any other supporting services dedicated to oil and gas activities in the Amazon. The research also looked at all of the project, trade, and general corporate financing activities of the banks, including, importantly, syndicated loans, which are loans where several banks get together to pool credit and provide a large amount of credit. In this case, we're mostly concerned with oil traders and oil exploration and production projects, where these syndicated loans actually provide huge opportunities for oil expansion. And we believe that these are also a loophole in a lot of bank policies and need to be addressed and excluded. On the investment side, we think that the oil and gas exclusion policy should include all equity and bonds held directly by banks, and that any company that has more than 5% of their revenue from oil and gas activities in the Amazon should be immediately considered as high risk in bank ESR frameworks, both on the investment and the financing side. And that means that their screening process should be very specific and should probably reduce or eliminate the opportunities for finance and investment for those companies. This is a broad scope, broader even than the Arctic exclusions that Pendle mentioned before. And it can seem a bit daunting initially for banks to take this on. But we have to remember that the Arctic exclusions were similarly perceived as such, but inevitably those arguments related to Indigenous peoples' rights, to the vulnerability of these areas to climate change, to the importance of these areas in mitigating climate change, and the importance of these areas in terms of global biodiversity, win the day in favor of the policy. And this is a policy approach that really accepts the urgency of the actions needed today to combat climate change, the importance of avoiding as soon as possible all the planned and possible expansion of oil and gas in the Amazon, in line with the Paris Climate Agreement targets, and also with the advice from the IEA of not having any more new oil wells after the end of 2021. So, and I'm just going to bring up a slide here to talk a little bit more about what this research looked like that spurred on the Amazon oil and gas exclusion and exit strategy. We developed a scorecard of the top EU and US banks currently financing or investing in oil and gas activities in the Amazon. We rated the strength of their policies to exclude 6 key risks associated with Amazon oil and gas, as well as their actual exposure to Amazon oil and gas via their finance and investment decisions. Those 6 key risks include climate change, deforestation, biodiversity loss, the infringement of Indigenous people's rights, pollution, and corruption. And I'm not sure if you've seen any of the headlines recently about the corruption that's been revealed amongst oil traders active in the Amazon. These 6 key risks were, we looked at the quality of the bank policy at managing those risks. And we also looked at the exposure that the banks have to the top 100 oil and gas companies active in the Amazon today through finance and investments. That report is publicly available, and we can share a link after the webinar. And it shows that no banks are currently leaders in protecting the Amazon. It really revealed to us that there is a policy missing. There are, however, several frontrunners and contenders who could build on their current policy commitments, reduce their exposure to Amazon oil and gas by reducing their finance and investment in the region, and enact an Amazon exclusion policy. These banks include BNP Paribas, ING, Credit Suisse, and Natixis, who have already committed publicly to excluding their trade finance for Amazon oil. There are also several banks named in the report who are laggards or followers in this movement, such as JP Morgan Chase, HSBC, and Deutsche Bank, who continue to support the oil and gas industry in the Amazon and lack even some of the basic policies to manage the risks that they are complicit in the rainforest destruction.
Thank you so much, Angeline. That was an incredible summary. I'm going to ask our team, oh good, they have. The report and ranking is listed in the chat for those of you who are looking for the link. You can also find out more by going to the new Amazon exclusion website, exitamazonoilandgas.org. We're going to open up now to questions. We have questions that have been coming in from the audience to our panelists. I see we have now doubled the amount of people who have joined us today. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you've just joined, just to note, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where you can ask questions, and also a live interpretation function at the bottom of your screen. Just click on interpretation and choose your language. So first of all, I'm going to ask Pendle if you can address this question. We have a question that comes in about Ecuador. I thought that Ecuador was one of the few countries or states in the world that outlaws ecocide and supports the rights of nature. What protection is there in the law?
Yes, so the rights of nature are actually integrated into the Ecuadorian constitution. So opening up oil drilling in national parks and indigenous lands seems to run very counter to this. And it's tricky because indigenous peoples do not have subsurface rights. So this means that any oil or gas or natural resources that are found below the surface of their territories, the government is allowed to move forward on, as long as it employs what's called FPIC, or free, prior, and informed consent. But it's important to point out that FPIC, or Free, Prior, and Informed Consent, which is a policy that a lot of banks may have included in their rules around the kinds of projects that they will finance, is supposed to involve getting fully informed consent from Indigenous peoples and communities whose lands a company is trying to operate on. But a lot of the times in practice, this is not what's happening. So companies will employ sort of divide and conquer strategies where they will separate communities and maybe consult one person in the community or not a proper representative of the community. Bribing might be involved, and essentially the kind of consent that companies claim to have is non-existent. And so companies are continuing to drill and exploit without the proper consent from communities. I think I'll leave it at that. And I think we have some questions for our panelists from Confeñai as well. They may be able to speak to this as well.
Thank you, Pendle. Any of our guests from Confeñai, would you like to address that question? If not, I have another one for you that's already come in. I always wait a moment for the translation, but I'm going to give you our second question.
Bueno, quisiera, gracias también por las preguntas. Realmente dentro de la Constitución existe el derecho a la naturaleza. Y eso debe que acatarse, debe que acatar el gobierno con lo que estamos a nivel internacional. Ecuador presenta un espacio territorial de la naturaleza, el Yasuní en especial. Pero existen otros espacios territoriales que son áreas de conservación, que tienen bosques protectores, también las áreas de conservación, pero sin embargo, dentro de lo que está en la Constitución, derecho a la naturaleza, que debe que ser conservado, sin embargo, absolutamente lo podemos decir, le secuestra el gobierno con este decreto del 95, donde que ya no existe derecho a la naturaleza. No da prioridad de decir de que estamos conservando, más bien decreta a las transnacionales, a las empresas transnacionales, entregar el territorio de la nacionalidad. Eso es un genocidio directamente a las nacionalidades. Es un genocidio que acaba toda la naturaleza, acaba con los bosques, acaba con los animales, acaba con los ríos. En ese sentido, nosotros, las nacionalidades, estamos en pie de lucha. La Confeñai está apoyando y sigue apoyando a las nacionalidades que están defendiendo su territorio. Y nosotros como organización regional, como Confeñai, estamos protegiendo los derechos colectivos, respondiendo a las necesidades de cada una de las nacionalidades. En ese sentido, el gobierno no ha aplicado una consulta previa y de consentimiento. El gobierno no ha hecho una consulta. El gobierno ha entregado a las empresas petroleras y mineras que ellos hagan la consulta. Las empresas petroleras no tienen por qué hacer la consulta, sino el gobierno. En ningún momento ha hecho eso. Y es por eso que nosotros, como Confeñai, estamos en lucha por la decisión de las nacionalidades, porque queremos vivir en un ambiente sano, libre y sin contaminación. Pero el gobierno no lo ve. Lo ve, sin embargo, extraer todos los recursos. Ha habido recursos que han estado sacando de hace años, 40 años de petróleo, pero la Amazonía sigue en pobreza. Más grandes han sido hoy. Se ve Quito, Guayaquil, Cuenca, son los lugares más que van todos estos recursos. En la Amazonía no hay, vemos toda la contaminación. Todo el recurso que sale, el petróleo, los más beneficiarios son, vuelvo y repito, Quito, Guayaquil, Cuenca, esas ciudades son los que han recibido todo el recurso. En ese sentido, pedimos y vamos a estar en proceso de lucha. Con todo esto, los dirigentes quienes están al frente han sido amenazados por las empresas, por el gobierno en especial. Y es lo que estamos luchando, somos lo que necesitamos, vivir en territorio sano, en bosque y nada más. Para nuestra generación es por eso que estamos luchando. Eso para poder comentarlo, todo lo que es el gobierno no respeta, no acata de acuerdo a la Constitución lo que dice derecho a la naturaleza. No respeta. Los ministerios entregan concesiones de reserva para poder explotar la minería, el petróleo, sin consulta previa y consentimiento. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I'm terribly sorry for the confusion in the translation. I'm going to ask our team in the background if they can make sure that those are on the appropriate channels. Apparently the English translation was on the Spanish channel for that. So I apologize for that. And we'll try and get that fixed as we move forward. So keeping along the same line of discussion, we had a question come in Spanish. Andreas Tapia, I'm going to ask you if you could speak to it. The rough translation of the question is, I agree that the Ecuadorian state has destroyed the Amazon and has not properly consulted its inhabitants. Now the state has always said that oil and gas and mining and exploitation is necessary to feed the entire country. In that way, it is using a political discourse of solidarity. How do you respond to this issue? Andreas, would you like to take that question? It's a big one. I was waiting for the translation to see if Andreas, are you with us still?
Sí, gracias. Este es un discurso que lo ha venido manejando el gobierno. No estamos muy de acuerdo, porque la emergencia sanitaria de COVID-19, la pandemia, ha demostrado más bien al radio que no ha sido ni la explotación minera ni la explotación petrolera lo que ha permitido al pueblo ecuatoriano salir de la crisis económica. Al contrario, durante la fase más invasiva de la pandemia en todo el territorio ecuatoriano, fue el campo el que de manera solidaria aportó con la alimentación hacia todos los centros urbanos. Es decir, en ningún momento ni la explotación minera ni la explotación petrolera han sido una salvación para todo el pueblo ecuatoriano, cuando sí el incentivo al agro y sobre todo desde los sectores rurales hemos contribuido de manera directa y concreta a la reactivación económica y a superar la etapa más fuerte de la crisis. Al contrario, los réditos y las regalías de la explotación petrolera lo que hacen es distribuirse no en las inmensas mayorías, sino concentrarse en torno a la ganancia de las mismas empresas y también crecer el aparato burocrático del Estado, pero los resultados concretos no se revierten en las zonas de explotación. Tanto así que provincias históricamente petroleras en el nororiente, como Orellana y Sucumbíos, tienen los mayores índices de pobreza, de desnutrición y de cáncer, por ejemplo. Entonces vemos que los efectos son contrarios a los que pregonan los gobiernos. Pero durante la emergencia sanitaria, al contrario, hemos visto que sí ha habido un aporte concreto desde el sector del agro, y también que en esta etapa de reactivación económica están siendo, por ejemplo, los emprendimientos de turismo comunitario, los microemprendimientos, los emprendimientos también relacionados con la agricultura, los que están generando economías familiares que están permitiendo salir de esta crisis. Así que nosotros pensamos que más bien todo el proceso de explotación, incluso en tiempos de pandemia, fue el que generó la ola de contagio masiva, la que trajo incluso la pandemia a varios de los territorios indígenas del interior. Los primeros contagios procedieron de las zonas con explotación minera, de las zonas donde existían trabajadores petroleros e incluso del boom por la extracción de la fiebre de la balsa. Entonces, el extractivismo solo ha traído históricamente y en la actual coyuntura de la pandemia mayor contagio, mayor contaminación, pero más bien desde el campo se han demostrado alternativas específicas y concretas para salir de la crisis económica.
Thank you so much, Andreas. Related on this economic conversation is the issue of debt. There has been a lot of talk about how debt drives these extractive industries in many countries in the global south. And I'm wondering, Pendle, if you can comment specifically on the debt question and if and how that is driving new oil extraction in the Amazon.
Yes, so I think we've touched on this actually in some of our previous questions and in our answers that we've heard from leadership from Compañía. But yeah, this issue of sustainable development and how countries like Ecuador can get out of debt is deeply tied to the oil and gas industry because we've seen that a lot of the oil and gas exploitation and the promises to drill are directly linked to debt that Ecuador already owes to a number of outside countries. And so we really need to figure out a way to shift away from an exploitative, extractive model of development, which I think is what has been made clear by this conversation. And I think this is actually also, the typical response that we get in conversations with bank leadership around pushing for an Amazon exclusion policy is this concern that if they adopt an exclusion policy or if they no longer finance oil and gas, that they are essentially ending their support or their financial flow to countries like Ecuador, because so much of these countries' oil and gas industries are nationalized. We're really trying to push banks to look at other ways of supporting these countries, investing in other directions. I think this may have been touched on earlier in our discussion, but one of the things that Indigenous and frontline communities are calling for is reparations for the harm that has been caused by the oil and gas industries and exploitation on their territories. And so this model of constantly drilling further and further in order to make up for debt that countries have amassed is not a functional one. And I'm not sure if our other panelists might want to speak more to that. I know, Angeline, you might have some thoughts on that as well, but I will leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Pendle. Angeline, did you want to add?
No, that was great, Pendle.
Thank you. I will add one thought, which is that this question of new oil extraction in order to feed a nation's debt, which we're also seeing in many other countries of the global south, at the exact same moment, of course, that it was mentioned before that the IPCC, the IEA, are all calling for an end to fossil fuel expansion in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So this question is exactly one of the reasons that the organizations here, including the indigenous organizations, as well as Amazon Watch and Stand.Earth, are endorsing and calling for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. You can find information about that at fossilfueltreaty.org. We're joined in this effort this week from elected officials from around the world. And I hope many of you have seen that 101 Nobel laureates and over 2,000 scientists have also endorsed the fossil fuel treaty. If we are going to end fossil fuel expansion, not just in the Amazon, but around the world, we're going to need international cooperation to address some of these critical barriers like debt. Nation states have been slow to stop fossil fuel expansion and production. And that's why, one of the reasons why this exclusion policy is so important, that private institutions and banks take action now to ensure that they're meeting up their commitments for human rights and climate leadership. And on that note, I want to turn back to you, Angeline. We have a number of questions that have come in. I'm going to give you two and ask you if you can address this. The first is how is oil drilling connected to other impacts and deforestation in the Amazon? Why are you focusing, just on oil drilling now and not these other extractive industries? And then secondly, why is bank leadership so critical to protect intact areas of the Amazon? There have been exclusion policies in other areas, Arctic tar sands. What's happening with those and what have we learned from them? So those questions to you, Angeline.
Well, first of all, we're focusing on oil and gas is really about looking at where we fit into this movement. There are a lot of other organizations who are looking at Amazon deforestation, particularly through the lens of the agricultural drivers of deforestation, beef and soy being chief among those. So we're fitting into a broader movement and looking at oil and gas as a forest fragmentation driver. So I don't know if we mentioned sort of the concept of the first cut being the deepest, but Amazon oil and gas really focuses on going into intact forest landscapes, pursuing major oil fields and potentials. And that creates a lot of roadways into areas where you wouldn't have a real economic driver for building that type of infrastructure otherwise. Those roadways bring roadside colonization and bring on various types of other deforestation drivers. And this is not a phenomenon that is isolated in the Amazon. Across the world, we see the impact and the correlation between the building of roads into intact forests and the destruction of those forests over time through various modes of deforestation. So one of the things we really want to stress, and what we found of interest when speaking to banks, is that it's not always front of mind to think of oil and gas as a driver of deforestation when you're thinking about the absolute hectares of forests that are destroyed by all of these different deforestation driver commodities. But actually, it's a really important one because it's like the point of the spear. So while it might not clear the most area, it actually opens up a lot of area. And we can argue also the same for forestry and mining. And the focus here is because there's such a huge economic motivation to keep expanding oil and gas in the Amazon, that it really becomes sort of one of the most concerning activities. And obviously the connection to combating climate change and reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, and thinking globally about the areas where fossil fuel reductions need to occur now in order to also save our major natural climate mitigation areas, such as the Amazon, the Arctic, these big rainforests and important areas. So I think that there's a lot, it's a good question, and there are a lot of reasons why we would look at other industries, but there's a really good reason why we're focusing here. And the second question If you could just recap that for me, Sephora, sorry.
The question was, Angeline, what can we learn from the Arctic and the tar sands? But I'm afraid we are at time.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask people if you have more questions to please contact us at stand.earth and also at Amazon. And specifically on this initiative, you'll find a lot of the information you're looking for and ways to engage with this initiative at exitaamazonoilandgas.org. I'll ask folks from the team here to put that again in the chat so people can access that information. We will be doing more public events as well as public calls for you to join us as we target specific banks who are laggards in this sector and haven't responded to the call. Most importantly today, I want to thank our Indigenous colleagues for joining us from the Amazon for the launch of this initiative. Your dedication, your stories, your power is an inspiration. And we look forward to hearing more from you, from many of you at COP26, at further events. Please, I'm asking everyone who is here to share this initiative, to join us today. There really is no more critical issue as we face a world increasingly on fire than protecting the heart of the Amazon, which is so critical for global climate stability, and ending oil extraction today in the Amazon, as you've heard, so essential for addressing human rights and the livelihoods of First Peoples. So again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your many questions. Please contact the team specifically if you have questions that we weren't able to answer in the webinar. And again, exitaamazonoilandgas.org to continue to support this important initiative. And if you are joining us today from any of the major banks, we encourage you also to contact us. We have done significant research and would love to work with you to ensure that you're addressing these issues urgently and living up to your climate and human rights commitments at this important moment in history. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today at this important seminar during Climate Week.